Welcome. Thank you for being here. I am Dr. Rebecca Troy, and these are our fabulous client graduate case studies. So if you have never been with us before on one of these, we actually share one of our graduates every other week. And so today's case that we're going to be talking about is Alex, who was 12 years old at the time that he completed the program. He is 13 now, but at the time that he went through, he was 12 years old. So we're going to specifically talk about his case and go through the data. So Alex's specific data, he started at the 73rd percent, or he was 73% accurate in his phonological awareness when he started, and a few months later he moved to 100% accurate. His reading scores on the wide range achievement test 5 went from the 42nd percentile to the 99.9th percentile, and his scores for spelling went from the 8th percentile to the 37th, with an additional 17 items that he had phonetically correct. So we'll talk about that in just a minute, which would have put him at the 99th percentile also for spelling had those been correct. But just a few quotes from Mom as we get started. She said, "I don't know what we would have done had it not been for this program. It seemed like this was the key for him. This was fixing it. Without this program, I don't know how he would have been a functional adult who had to write things down." So as we dive in today, I want to just briefly introduce you to, oops, and sorry if you are unmuted. I'm gonna just see if we can make sure everybody is muted here. Thank you. We are a company that helps to bring neuroscience into your home. And so there are neuroscience-based techniques for dyslexia that we teach families how to do. So everything that we are about to share is information that we taught Beth to do in her home within just 10 to 15 minutes a day. So if you leverage the power of neuroplasticity, if you do what we know good science allows the brain to do, it is possible to make these kinds of changes for kids within months, not years. And so we'll talk about this, but Beth specifically had been through years and years of therapy with Alex and hadn't really seen much improvement. But everything that we're about to talk about is something that Beth did on her own in 10 to 15 minutes a day at home through our coaching. So one of the reasons that we do this is, to just help show people what is possible, because I think it is true that there's just a lot of bad press out there about what dyslexia is and how you can support it. There are people who are literally saying there's nothing you could possibly do about dyslexia. This is something that you have to live with forever, and that is just simply not true. So we hope that through our presentation today, through Alex's case, that you can not only recognize that it is possible, but be inspired by those types of things as well. So as we dive in, I think it's really, really critical to give you just a basic understanding of what dyslexia is and why having a brain-based intervention excuse me, is really critical. So what you can see on the screen here are two fMRIs. So the one on the left is of a non-dyslexic person during a language task, and the one on the right is of a person with dyslexia during a language task. So you can see that there are neurological or neurobiological differences in these two brains. And I'll point some of these out. So in the person who does not have dyslexia, there is activity in the part of. So you can see that their occipital lobe, or where vision is controlled, is active during a language task, whereas the person with dyslexia literally does not have activity there. And also, if you look at these areas in the parietal temporal lobe, we can see that there is activity in a typical reader during a language task, whereas a person with dyslexia does not have that same activity. They have some, but it is far, far less. And so what that means is that when you have dyslexia, there is a disconnect in the brain between your visual and auditory system, which is why when you try to spell things, you might add letters in that aren't there. You might omit letters that are supposed to be there. You might even omit an entire syllable, and that's because what your brain sees and what you hear are not connected together. That's the same reason why you might see a word and try to decode that, and you're only getting the first two letters correct, and everything else is a guess. Or you might work really hard to decode a word, the same word that you see two lines later, and your brain completely forgets what it is. And so those are some of the things that happen because the brain isn't active for language in the same way that a typical reader is. So it's not because this person isn't smart. It's not because this person isn't trying hard. It's because their brain literally cannot use those same areas. But here's what's so, so powerful. So this is the same type of information, but with an EEG. So again, a typical reader is using all of these areas of the brain for language. The reader with dyslexia is not. But through remediation, you can actually create activity where there wasn't before. So what we know through the power of neural imaging and through all of the scientific studies that have been done over the last 40 years is that you really can change what the brain looks like over time. Just like we used to think that the world is flat, we know that intelligence is not fixed. You absolutely can change the dynamic of how the brain is functioning through what you do. Whether that is, I'd like to change my mindfulness, therefore I am practicing meditation every day. I mean, goodness, they've done studies on London cab drivers who had to study a map of the city, and they looked at their spatial awareness capacity in their brain before they had to study these tests and after, and they found that there was significant difference in the spatial awareness of the brain just through that repeated work. So it is absolutely possible to help a child with dyslexia to read and to spell, but it takes repetition, it takes intention. And what we're going to show you today is what actually happened to a young boy because he did this work at home with his mom. So specifically, we're going to hear from Beth, the mother to Alex, who is 12 years old, and we're going to tell his story. One of the reasons that we do this is we're not only sharing the data, but the real human life that was impacted by this program. So at the beginning, Alex had a little trouble sounding out words and with phonics and with reading, and always equating the same sound with the same letter. So oftentimes this happens when you are working with little people. You start decoding words and you're doing the typical beginning reading things, and it's hard. And it feels like you keep repeating the same thing over and over. And I just taught you that letter D, and it's like you forget it day after day after day. And so that was Beth's experience with Alex, is that he did have a little bit of trouble sounding out words, but Alex is really, really bright. And so he was able to memorize some things. And so his photographic memory picked up a few words that he was able to memorize and kind of trick her a little bit into thinking that he had it when really he didn't. But, as a homeschooling parent without a teaching degree, she initially thought, this is my fault. I'm just not teaching him right. And I think that that's important to recognize, because we hear that from hundreds of parents who, think that this is just a symptom of me not doing the right things. And maybe if I just tried a little harder, maybe if I just waited a little longer for you to develop this naturally, it would happen. But really, what she was dealing with is that his brain wasn't processing language in the same way. And so, as a result, Beth went out and tried everything that she could think of. So, she tried all kinds of different homeschool curriculum. She said, oh my goodness, Dr. Troy, I tried a different curriculum every year because I thought, well, maybe it's just the curriculum that I'm using. Maybe he's not responding to this. Maybe he doesn't like it. And so, that is the reason why he's maybe not performing. She, with homeschooling in the state that she's in, they had these special ed consultations that you could do. So you had a special educator come in, they recommended, okay, your child has dyslexia. This is what you need to try. This is the specific curriculum that you should use. They were recommended to do the Orton-Gillingham approach, which they did for several years. She did intensive phonics instruction. She did occupational therapy. They did speech therapy. They did vision therapy. She said, oh my goodness, we did everything under the sun that we could possibly think of. He graduated from all of these programs and he made some improvement. You know, he got to the point where he was able to read. It was never smooth, but he could read, but writing remained a major obstacle. He was still reversing letters like B and D, P and Q all of the time. He reversed almost all of his numbers. Everything was all mixed up and backwards. Even writing a sentence was hard for him. And she said, you know, it was challenging because even just one sentence could cause him to melt down. So, you know, for those of you who are listening who are homeschooling parents, you know how challenging it can be if your child is melting down for having to write one sentence. So you can imagine what Beth was going up against on a daily basis. She said, we were doing schoolwork, but I was scribing all of his answers. She recognized that that wasn't a viable long-term option, especially as Alex got older. She thought, what is this kid going to do? He's going to graduate from high school and I can't go with him. I'm not going to be able to write a sentence down that, you know, he can't write a sentence down that other people can read. I certainly can't be with him to scribe all of his things. And so she started to worry. She said, we're just not at a sustainable place. Yes, he can read, but he can't write at all, and he's so defeated and frustrated, and of course I am too. The school day was awful with constant frustration, and she reached a point where she thought, I might just give up on this, because it's like, well, either he's going to hate me and we can't do anything, or we're just going to give up on this for today. So, you know, I think sharing that and its honesty is maybe helpful for you as a parent, because Beth was in that same place too, where she recognized that, like, we either accept that Alex isn't going to write and he's going to have to rely on spell check, or he's just never ever going to feel confident about having to share his ideas on paper or communicate in any way in a written form, or we have to do something differently. And so she said, I have to confess that I wasn't super hopeful at the beginning. We've tried so many things, and I was like, well, here's one more thing, but we have to do it. Like, there's no way that we could possibly put Alex out into the world, so I have to give it a try. And so she said, quite honestly, Dr. Troy, that was my attitude when we started. And I think that that's important to share. So fast forward about 6 months, and she said his reading has really improved. He's volunteering to read things, and his brother doesn't complain, because before, you know, when the two brothers were homeschooling together, his older brother was constantly complaining, like, oh, Alex, he's got to read again. Now he doesn't say a word. In fact, I think Alex reads more quickly and smoothly than his brother does. My child that could write maybe a sentence if I sat on him until he cried, he just wrote me 3 or 4 paragraph paper about what he wanted to do on his birthday. And again, that's within 6 months time. He's not afraid to tackle big words with his spelling. So on his exit assessment, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, he spelled malfeasance, belligerent, cacophony, and pusillanimous phonetically correct. He had every single sound there, and he wasn't afraid to tackle that. Maybe he missed a couple of letters here and there in terms of the pattern, but he had every single sound represented. Again, in 6 months, this was a kid who was struggling to write a sentence at all. She said he's definitely much more confident, hugely more confident. I said, would you have ever 6 months ago imagined that you could do this today? And she said, no way. There's no way. When I ask him to do something, he doesn't say, I can't do that. He's like, okay. And that's huge for us. So, you know, when you think about into the future, she said, I didn't think this kid could get into college. There's no way he could write a paper. Well, now he's on his way. This program seems like it was the key for him. We made some improvements with all of that other intervention, but nothing was fixing it. And I feel like this is fixing it. This program finally fixed it and addressed the underlying issue that no program had before. And what she's talking about is his brain's ability to actually hear and respond to the language. So by repairing how his brain was using both the occipital lobe and the parietal temporal lobe, he was able to do things like, spell and read and write very successfully. She said, without this program, oh my goodness, I don't know how he would have been a functional adult who would have had to write things down. I mean, even typing was a huge issue for him. This program has been huge as far as really unlocking those doors for him, and what he can do now is anything that he wants. It doesn't have to hold him back. So let's take a look at Alex's data and talk about some of the major shifts and what that means in terms of educational statistics. So, this might be a little bit boring to you, but I want to teach you what the data actually means. So we kind of covered this a little bit at the top of the call, but when we look at phonological awareness, that's the brain's ability to actually hear and respond to words. So I would say, the word Germany. Alex, take away ma, what's left? So in order to be able to do that, he has to hear all of the sounds in the word Germany. He has to recognize that ma is the middle sound, be able to pull it out and say journey, put those two things together. So the brain's ability to hear and manipulate all of that, if you have dyslexia, is really, really challenging. So when he started the program, he had 11 of those test items incorrect. So he was only at 73% accurate. Fast forward 6 months, we teach his brain how to respond. He's at 100% accuracy. So that piece is massively going to impact his reading and spelling scores, which you're about to see. So before I show you these scores, I just want to help you to understand statistics a little bit more, just in case that's not what you normally talk about on your day-to-day. So this is what we call the normal distribution curve. And right in the center of this is the 50th percentile, or average. So through studying education and educational statistics, researchers have actually found how much growth is typical in an entire school year. So let's just say that the child is functioning at the 50th percentile. To move 0.3 of a standard deviation, so from this red to the blue in an entire school year, is typical. So if a child is in first grade, at the beginning of the year, they might be here. We would expect that by the end of the year, they would have grown this much. Or if the child is in 7th grade and they get through the end of the year, we expect that they grow this much. So we know the typical rate of growth that happens for kids in an entire school year. But if you have dyslexia, it is far, far less. And for most kids, they are barely making a gain, which is why it feels like year after year after year, you're kind of spinning on a hamster wheel and doing the same thing over and over again. So instead of making this much progress, that might be what your typical peers make, but you just kind of sit in the same spot that you were before. So the key is, if you're going to be doing an intervention with a child, you want to make sure that it has statistically significant impacts. So if an intervention has a moderate statistical significance, it means it moves them a 0.5 of a standard deviation or higher, or to this green line. But if you choose an intervention that is going to have statistical significance, it means that it moved them a 0.8 or higher. So that's almost a full one of these lines. So you went from performing at the 50th percentile to all the way up here, at like the 80th percentile. So this is meaning that you've made statistically significant growth, and we are positive that whatever that intervention was had a positive impact on you. So now, as we take a look at what happened for Alex, this red mark represents where he was at the beginning of the program, at the 42nd percentile. So if he would have made that typical growth that a child makes in an entire school year, it means he would have grown to this yellow. If he would have made statistically significant growth, like we know with certainty that this program had a positive impact on his reading ability, he would have gone to this tan dot right here. But Alex's progress made 1, 2, 3 standard deviations of growth within about 6 months. which, I mean, from a statistical standpoint is almost unheard of. Like, this is humongous growth for him to have that much of a leap in his progress within just 6 months' time. And so the question becomes like, how do you explain that? You can explain that by the changes that we've made to how his brain is processing language. So typically what happens is these are really smart kids. Alex is a really smart guy who's got an engineering brain, who's got the capacity to do so many things. It's just that his brain wasn't hearing and processing language correctly. But when you taught his brain how to do that, the only way that you can explain that is to say, holy cow, look at what he was able to do within 6 months, where he had done intervention and intervention and intervention for years and years before that without much of any progress. So this is the consequence of actually teaching his brain to process language. Then we take a look at his spelling. Similar picture. So spelling typically develops more slowly than reading, which is to be expected because we also have to add in the motor coordination of that. But he was at the 8th percentile when he started. So if he would have made the progress that a typical kid makes in an entire year, he would have gone to the yellow. If he would have had statistically significant progress in his spelling, he would have gone to this tan, but he leapt beyond that by almost another standard deviation, and he ended at the 37th percentile. So again, massive statistical gains in his spelling within 6 months. And then of note, he had words like belligerent, cacophony, pusillanimous. I mean, unbelievably challenging words that he was able to spell using every single one of the sounds, which means that his brain was able to hear all of those and represent that correctly, but he just didn't choose the correct pattern. So had he known the correct pattern for some of those, he would have been at the 99th percentile for spelling as well. So just massive, massive growth in phonological awareness, in reading, in spelling. Again, within 10 to 15 minutes of working with his mom every day, but changing the way that his brain responds. So I want to make sure that we mention and celebrate Beth throughout this process, because every bit of the data that I just shared is not a magic wand. Like, we didn't just wave it over Alex and say, poof, all of this data changed magically. This happened because Beth showed up to this program. She maintained daily consistency with the program. So repetition and consistency is really, really important. And she absolutely showed up to do that. None of this would have happened if she didn't. She leaned into the coaching of both the strategy and the mindset support. So our coaching team is available to clients constantly, but you have to be willing to lean in and get that type of support. And Beth absolutely did that. She made the learning fun for Alex. She celebrated his small wins. She's incredibly hardworking and willing to go the extra mile for her son. She was decisive, coachable, resourceful, and she continued to believe that greater things were possible for her son. So I just want to acknowledge that she absolutely could have let it go and said, well, he can read. No, he can't write, but there is spell check and it'll be fine. He'll just be okay. But instead, because she decided that that wasn't going to be acceptable and that he wasn't going to be able to be a participating citizen in his life the way that she wanted him to be, she showed up and she did the intensive work. And 6 months later, she has an entirely different kid who has a totally different skill set, confidence, independence, all of the things. So she said this program has been huge for him as far as really unlocking those doors and opening a future where he can do whatever it is that he wants to do. So I just think it's really important. Like, yes, the program is solid, but it doesn't happen without that partnership with a parent who is willing to do the work. So I wanted to just celebrate Beth for the amazing way that she showed up to support her son. So this is typical. You know, I think a question that we get a lot is like, does this happen? Is this just one kid? No, definitely not. I mean, we are celebrating a client graduate every other week to showcase what's possible, but our average client is making double what a statistically significant result would be. every time. So, we're super proud of that. And we are celebrating that our average kid is making 50 percentile points of gain in that 4 to 6 month window, which again speaks to the power of neuroplasticity and what happens if you do the right things. So if you are interested in educational statistics, if you want to dig into any of this stuff, John Hattie is a meta-analysis researcher, so he's done studies of studies. If you're curious about that and you want to dig in more, here's a citation for you, and you can kind of take a look at some of these references. But here's what I think is really powerful. When you look at all of the studies of the list of factors related to student achievement, 252 influences, some of the highest scores that we have on here are like a 1.5, 1.3, 1.2, 0.99. Alex's scores were 2.5 and a 2. So, I mean, if you're not into statistics, maybe that doesn't mean as much to you, but his scores blew the top off of what we know is the top research out there on how to impact student achievement. So we're super, super proud of that. We know that what we're doing is highly impactful. But I think, more importantly, when you do this, you have the ability to close the gap. So Alex didn't just make a little bit of progress, he closed the gap between himself and his peers. And why that's so critical is when you sit and spin for years and years, you do miss opportunities, whether that means you can't go out to recess because you have to stay in and finish your work, or you don't get to take the elective class that you wanted to take because you have to take reading intervention class, or you're missing out on being, in the classroom with your peers, or, you have to do 2 to 3 hours of homework every night and your friends don't have to, they get to go out and play, or you don't go for the college opportunity or the job that you wanted. I mean, there's always something that inevitably gets missed because you are stuck in this cycle of not being able to read and spell. There are current and ongoing struggles. There are future opportunities that you might miss. And it is really, really difficult, not only for the child who is struggling with dyslexia, but for their entire family. So as a parent of a dyslexic child, I know that it is difficult on mom. She is up researching all night long, trying to figure out what to do, how to best help. She worries about, are they seeing themselves as less than? I mean, that is a stressor in a major, major way. And so if you can fast track that progress and you can make it so that if I get really serious and if I do this for 10 to 15 minutes a day, I can have an entirely different outcome 6 months from now. That is a huge stress reliever for you as well. And it improves your academic performance. It increases your self-esteem and confidence. It gives you better mental health and greater access to opportunities. So if you are in the audience right now and you're thinking like, oh my goodness, I don't know if we're dealing with dyslexia. It seems like we are. I'm seeing some of the signs and symptoms that I think it might be, but I would really like that certainty. I would invite you to our upcoming dyslexia discovery workshop. So we offer these every couple of months where we really dive in and we give you the assessment tools to figure out for sure if your child is dealing with dyslexia. So just like the assessments that we gave to Alex, we look at phonological awareness, we look at reading, we look at spelling, and we say, across all of these tests, are we really seeing the evidence of what would be dyslexia? And so we can definitely help you with that. If you are in need of that type of support, please leave your name in the comments and our team would be happy to reach out to you and help you to kind of untangle that so that you can figure out once and for all if that's really what your child is dealing with. Also, if you are in the audience and you're like, you know what, I am a parent of a child with dyslexia, and I know that we were just like Beth. We are in the middle of doing tutoring multiple times a week, or we're getting school intervention and it's not helping, or, we haven't started yet, but I know we really need to. And you are inspired about what is possible with the right neurological support, I would invite you to reach out to our team. We offer a complimentary call for everybody to just make sure that it's a fit. So we want it to be a fit on your side, like you or a child has the symptoms that we can actually help. And we want it to be a fit on our side too, because we're looking to help people who are actually willing to show up. It doesn't do anybody any good to invest in services like this and then not be willing to show up like Beth did. So we'll help you to unravel that and see if it is really a good fit, but those are complimentary, and we would invite you to really see if that's true with a member of our team. So with that, that concludes this week's case study review. We will be doing another one in 2 weeks. So if you're interested to come on back, we would be happy to have you.